Wealth Tactic Rebels, ingenious tactics to accumulate wealth for people who see things differently.
Welcome to another discussion with Wealth Tactic Rebels. In today's talk, we're going to be starting part 2, episode 1 of our mortgage discussion. Talking with us today is mortgage expert David Steinberg of Summit Funding, and he's been with them for about 31 years. And we're going to be talking about the current mortgage landscape and what to expect when you are applying for a mortgage. David's also going to help demystify some of the common concepts around them. I'm your host, Kevin Dumont with Dumont Wealth, and I've been thinking differently in the wealth field for well over 10 years. And joining us with our guest today is David Steinberg.
Hi, Kevin. So my company, Summit Funding, was started about 31 years ago with a simple premise. How can we make it as easy as humanly possible for someone to get a mortgage?
Sure.
So, for example, when you call a large bank, you're an anonymous figure. With us, you're a client and you're working with people who know you and care about you and care to get you the best results. And along that path, we also have several other concepts. So, for example, normally when you apply for a mortgage, you pay all your fees up front.
Right.
Well, when you work with Summit Funding, what we do is we do not charge up front fees.
Oh, that's nice.
If, for example, there's an appraisal fee, we'll shake up front as to what it's going to cost you. Mm-hmm. And then when the deal is all done, when you're ready to close, you'll reimburse us for the money we've laid out on your behalf. Okay. We work very hard to make it easy to get a mortgage.
Well, that's nice in today's world. Most organizations seem to be much less hands-on. They're much more cold about things.
Right.
For lack of a better term, everything seems to be institutionalized now.
And like you, we're working with people who we care about.
Right. So
when it's about the customer and not about the transaction, when it's about the best outcome and not about the best profit, right, we have a different approach to dealing with people.
Completely. It's like calling a number and getting a person on the other end. That's a good thing.
Oh, yeah. We talking about that, you never get voicemail during business hours.
Yeah, fantastic. We
actually have real human beings answering the phone.
Imagine that. In a world where Siri answers everything. Not that Siri's a bad thing. It is a good thing. Siri, Alexa, or whatever you use, right? But, personal touch. So, David, we love what you're doing with your business there. Can you talk a little bit more, using your expertise about, what's going on right now in the mortgage world?
Mortgage world has stabilized. Think back, it's now 10, 12 years since the debacle of 2007, 2008, and the market is recovering. It may never get back to where we were in terms of some of the convenience factors.
Sure.
So a lot of people blame no income verification mortgages for the debacle. I really don't.
Right.
If you take a very responsible individual who's buying a house, let's say for $1 million, and they're putting down $300,000, and they have perfect credit, and they have money in the bank, and they have a job, that's all you really need to know.
Right.
But it was abused.
Right.
And so what's happened is they've thrown the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, they took it to another extreme.
They took it to the other extreme. Nevertheless, 10 years ago, when you did a mortgage, you were very tightly constrained. Yeah. And year after year, what we've seen is common sense things returning to the marketplace.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's about taking 1 year of tax returns instead of 2 years of tax returns.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's about stretch products for people who really have specific situations, and therefore the market needs to accommodate them.
Yeah.
So let's say someone who's self-employed who may have very good income, but it's hard to prove on the books.
Right.
Someone like that, there are products available today that weren't available 24, 48 months ago.
Right. So what kind of products are we talking about?
Well,
not to get too much into the products, but just to kind of give our listeners a little idea of what they can expect.
So let's take it, for most people, most people think when they think of a mortgage, they think of a 30-year fixed rate mortgage.
Right.
And for a lot of people, that's a great option.
Right.
It's self-amortizing. The payment is the same for all 360 months. And that may be the perfect solution for some people.
Right.
For many people, it's not.
Right.
And so part of the art of having this conversation is understanding what the buyer's needs are, what the borrower's needs are, and then looking to meet those needs. So, for example, if you were buying a home,
sure,
and you were going to, and we had a conversation, you said, "Well, how long are you going to be in the house?"
Okay, let's say 10 years.
10 years. Well, if you're going to be in the house 10 years, then we need to be conservative, right? We need to get a mortgage that will last you. And since you're guessing 10 years, is 15 years possible?
It's possible.
Possible. So we need to look at that range of time frame. How risk averse are you? We look at that.
Right.
So some people race cars.
Guilty.
Some people race cars. Some people jump out of airplanes.
Yeah.
And some people were a life preserver to the bathtub. So if you have someone who is very much a risk taker, an adjustable rate mortgage may or may not work for them.
Right.
Someone who is much more buttoned up, you're going to go with a fixed rate mortgage.
Right.
We look at time frame, we look at age, we look at cash flow. So if you know someone who has a life event coming out, when you're meeting somebody who's in their late 50s, for example, and in 10 years they'll probably be retired, and that'll change how what cash flows they have. Yeah. That'll all go into the equation, and we'll figure that out.
Okay.
Now, let me just take one other thing. Let me ask that question again. Now you're going to tell me you're going to be in the house 5 years.
Okay.
How long are you going to be in the house?
5 years.
5 years. I love it. Well, a 30-year fix may be overkill.
Right.
For someone who's going to be in the house 5 years.
Right.
Maybe a 7-year adjustable would be a great median. Now, the rate would still be fixed for that 5 or 7 or 10 years, but you're going to pay a lower rate than the 30-year fixed.
Right.
So by engineering the solution to meet the need, we do a better job for the client.
Good point. So when the client does come to you, you kind of help them figure out what's going to work for them. Obviously, the next step is applying. So what can they expect with that?
Okay. Generally speaking, when someone goes out and starts thinking about buying a home,
right,
they're in the process. Very early in the process, I would say often even before they start talking to a realtor, they ought to meet with their mortgage guy, me.
Right.
And they ought to start to understand what their financial capacity is. Now, generally speaking, in today's market, may change a year from now, but in today's market, the sellers are still in a dominant position in many, many markets. Obviously, there are markets that are in much more trouble, but generally today, sellers are in control of the market. What that means is that a buyer walking in to make an offer has to be pre-approved for their mortgage.
Okay.
And so early on, whether it before they meet the realtor or just after they meet the realtor, they have to meet with a mortgage professional. And it's important to understand what the bank is looking for when they evaluate a loan application.
Right.
So I tell my clients to think about it as a 2x2 grid. And so there are 4 boxes, and the boxes are income, assets, credit, and property.
Right.
Now, on the income side, we want to know, can you afford the property you're looking to buy?
Right.
Primarily, for most people, that means what sources of income that you have that are reliable. Mm-hmm. So your job, your business, your investments.
Right.
If you have a stream of predictable income, we evaluate that income to determine what your qualifying income is.
Right. Okay.
So that's step number 1. We'll come back to it when we get deeper.
Right.
Step number 2 is assets. You have the resources necessary to make the down payment. So we were talking before about $1 million home.
Right.
if you're buying $1 million home and you're putting down 30%, 25%, whatever that number is, you need a certain amount of down payment. Right? So it may be $300,000. Then you need the money for the closing costs. Well, depending on the market, that could be $15,000, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 even, depending on the marketplace. And so you need to be able to show that you have, in that case, $325,000, $340,000.
Right.
Finally, the bank's going to want to know, do you have the reserves to carry you if there's a blip?
Right, of course. Which unfortunately happens to people.
Right. So therefore you need $350,000, $360,000, $400,000, depending on the loan program, depending on the specifics. But you, for your own good, you want to make sure that you have that reserve. And so we're going to look at that.
Yeah.
So now we've done income and assets. The next is credit. Credit is, do you have a predisposition to pay your bills?
Right.
Now, it sounds silly, but there are people out there with 800 credit, and they pay their bill meticulously. Mm-hmm. And then there are people out there with 600 credit scores. Mm-hmm. And what that means is they're spotty in paying their credit. Mm-hmm. And that will, again, impact your ability to get a mortgage and what kind of mortgage, et cetera.
Rates and whatnot, yeah.
The second component of credit goes back to the capacity question. So if you have 2 car loans and $100,000 of credit card debt and $200,000 of student loans, well, gee, that may be $10,000 a month or $5,000 a month of monthly carry just to pay that. Right. So now we go back to the capacity, right? We talked about income. We said you have sufficient income to buy the house, but it's not only carrying the house, but it's carrying the house and all that other debt.
Right, of course.
And finally, property. And property runs to 2 questions. One is the house that you're looking to purchase? Now, that at a pre-qual standpoint or pre-approval standpoint, we don't have that property. But nevertheless, in order to understand what the bank will ultimately look at, for property, if you're paying $1 million, is a house worth $1 million? Is it worth $1.1 million or is it worth $900,000?
Right.
So you may have fabulous credit, but no bank is going to want to lend you $700,000, say, if the property is only worth $800,000, or they'll want to take a risk adjustment on that.
Right.
So property, one part of property is, does the property support the mortgage? The other part of property, just so you think ahead, is what's the property condition? And there, you may have a magnificent property, but it has asbestos, it has mold, it has other issues.
Right.
So the bank is not really going to look at an engineering report, but nevertheless, if there's something obvious, that will become an issue in terms of purchasing a property.
Interesting point. I don't think everyone realizes that when they're applying. They think it's more a matter of income and assets, right? They don't think that they're looking at the home and there's something, maybe the main support beam is broken or
cracked foundation. We get it all the time.
Right.
There's a crack in the foundation, and now you need an engineer to tell the bank, tell you as the buyer, because you're a potential owner, you don't want to buy a lemon, but also tell the bank that there isn't a problem that would cause the instability of the property and therefore diminish the value of the property.
Right. Of course, something like that breaks after you bought the house. That $900,000 house is now worth what? $7. You took a loan for $8. You're underwater.
And now this is a great point. We talked about some of the kinds of products. We talked about fixed and adjustable before, but sometimes really more in the lower price range, in the $500,000, $600,000, $700,000, maybe $300,000 sometimes. Mm. Some of our buyers come to us. I had a guy buy a house last summer, and he bought a house for about $400,000, and he needed $150,000 worth of work.
Wow!
Right, and so what we did was we put him into a renovation loan.
Oh,
so what that loan allowed him to do was we had the appraisal based on the ultimate value of the house after all repairs.
Right.
After all repairs, right? So you're buying a house for $400,000, say, but after you put $100,000 in, or $200,000, that house may be worth $400,000 again.
Right.
But it could be worth $700,000. Right? Because if you have a house that's in not great condition, maybe there's some aesthetic issues, maybe there's some functional issues.
Right.
But when you've done the work, and in this case, by putting in about $150,000, I think you paid $450,000. By putting in about $150,000, that house was going to be worth $700,000.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah.
So he had a great eye. He found a great property, and then what we did, we put him into a renovation loan. And that loan lent him, let's say, 90% of the acquisition. Mm. So $360,000 for the acquisition, plus 90% of the balance, right? Mm. So I think the numbers were 400 and 150, something like that. So if their total was 550, he borrowed about 490.
Oh, wow.
He borrowed about $490, and he had all of that money available, and he did the renovation. Coming out of that, now he has a house that's basically brand new to his own specification.
Wow. It's a pretty good way of doing it, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think everyone really wants to get into that. So a lot of people like to just move and ready. But,
right.
But, that's part of your personal touch there that you get to, you can help people with, right?
Right.
So are there any other, people have a lot of common concepts of what they think about. Is there anything else you can think of that, you could help our listeners with? Something that's a common concept that maybe it's just not quite like that, something we could demystify.
So let's talk about 2 or 3 things. I bet some of our listeners are parents who have younger adult children. Many people don't know that they can co-sign for their kids' mortgage. And so now you get somebody who's, let's say they're in their 50s or 60s, they're still working, they still have a good income, and their kid may be starting out, they're making $75,000 a year. They can afford barely the property.
Right.
And we can do a loan so that, let's say, the child finds a $400,000 property, they just misqualify.
Right.
They need $100,000 to qualify, and they only have income of $80,000.
Right.
By having the parent co-sign for their child, they can get into that home and then get in early and then stop renting and get the appreciation. So that's one thing that we see quite often. Another thing is, you and I have had this conversation before, and the question is often, what's the optimal loan amount?
Right.
Now, there are a lot of people who have, let's call it 3 misconceptions. One misconception is that they should put down as big a down payment as they can afford.
Right. Of course, yeah. That's definitely something we talk about. Yeah.
Right. So, you get some people and they say, well, I'm going to buy a property for $1 million. I've got $500,000 in the bank. I'm going to put $500,000 down.
Right.
And that is a questionable strategy. It may be right for some people, but from an economic standpoint, that may be emotionally right for some people. But from an economic standpoint, I believe that a smaller down payment is wiser.
Right.
Another thing that people don't understand is that mortgages are available up to, in New York, New Jersey, and parts of Florida, and Connecticut, many other markets, you can get a mortgage up to about $679,000. That's a magic number. It's a conforming limit, high balance conforming limit.
Yes.
So, and you can do that with 3, 4, 5% down.
Oh, wow.
So maybe you have someone who went to graduate school, went to law school, went to medical school, and now they're out with a great job.
Right.
They have a job, they have great income, but they don't have a lot of assets.
Right.
And they can buy a home. So let's say they find a home for $700,000. and they put down 5%. Well, that's $35,000. He can get a $665,000 mortgage. And yet they're going to pay a higher rate. Yes, they're going to pay mortgage insurance. But, that gets them in the door early.
Yep.
And that's an advantage that people don't understand. I saw a statistic yesterday that something like 75% of millennials believe that you need to put down 20% to get a mortgage.
Right.
Where in truth it could be 3, 4, 5%.
Right, because 10 years ago, you had to put at least 20% down to even begin to qualify. So now that's kind of what people think is still going on, right?
Well, 10 years ago, you could have done 3, 4, 5%.
Right.
It's a misconception. It's one of those urban myths.
Right.
And once, I think it's depression mentality, depression age mentality. So a lot of us learned finance from our parents and grandparents who lived through the Depression.
True, yeah.
And they believed that you had to have 20% down. And that's what they taught us.
Right.
And that myth has not changed, has not followed the reality of what's happening in the mortgage market.
That's interesting to see where that actually comes from. Boy. So it's not so much of, 10 years ago, because the mortgage marketplace tightened its belt, you had to put 20% down. It's more of, that was something that was commonly thought of from Depression era, right?
I'm in this business 30 years ago. 30 years ago, it was harder to get a mortgage on a $400,000 property without putting down 20%. But for the last 15 years, 20 years, that's just been standard practice.
Yeah. Interesting. So I just want to touch a little bit, too. You mentioned that sometimes, economically speaking, it's not in the best interest of people to put the most they can put down towards the home. Why do you believe that is so?
Great question. So I use the following story. A guy wins the lotto.
Right.
He wins, and so he wins $1 million.
Okay. Yeah.
And they offer him two possibilities. One possibility is that they're going to give it to him in market securities.
Okay.
$1 million, you get in market securities, do whatever you want with it. The other possibility is they're going to drive up to your house with a backhoe. They're going to dig a pit 20 feet deep in your backyard. They're going to put the money in a safe, the safe in the pit, cover the pit with sand, and you can't touch that till you walk away from the property. Now, there aren't a lot of people who would take the latter alternative.
Right.
There aren't a lot of people who would bury the money in the ground.
Right.
But nevertheless, many of those same people would pay their mortgage down or prepay their mortgage, not realizing that functionally what they're doing is they're digging their money in a hole in the ground.
Good point.
When you have the cash in your hand, you have liquidity. You have the choice. I call it money is king.
Right,
cash is king. So when the cash is in your hand, you have choices. You can make decisions.
Yep.
When it is buried in the equity in your house, you may have a smaller mortgage. There may be some satisfaction elements around that. Right. But for most of the clients that you and I talk to, I believe it's a mistake.
Right. Yeah. Good analogy. That kind of goes back to what we talk about a lot too in Wealth Tactic Rebels is it's not always about smaller payments or even about which one is going to give you the best rate of return. It's which one is going to allow you to have liquidity so you can access that money to use it whenever you want, and you're going to have control over that. And liquidity, use, and control is what you're saying. So that's kind of what you're saying.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly.
And the tax law has an impact.
Sure.
Up to a year ago, if let's say you had a $600,000 house, say, and you had a $400,000 mortgage, you could still take another $100,000 out on an equity line, and that would be deductible. And you can use that money for anything.
Right.
Well, that's no longer true.
Right.
So, for example, let's say you bought a house. And we're talking about $1 million house. Let's talk about that $1 million house.
Right.
You have that $1 million house. You borrow $750,000, which is the maximum you can deduct today on a home. And let's say you have a liquidity event. somebody gives you $100,000. You inherit $100,000.
Right.
And you have two choices.
Right.
Should I have that $100,000 or should I put it into the mortgage? Maybe I should pay off the mortgage.
Right.
Pay $100,000 off the mortgage. A lot of people emotionally respond and they want to pay off the mortgage.
Yeah, sure.
But from an economic standpoint,
right,
that is putting the money in a hole in the ground.
Right, exactly. Just talk about the bearing in the safe in the back. Yeah.
And now imagine 2 years from now, that guy put the $100,000 into the mortgage. Now there's a liquidity event. He needs to borrow the $100,000 back.
Right.
Well, there's a couple of problems. Number one, that's $100,000 will no longer be deductible.
Right.
So he lost the deductibility. And then number two, depending on the nature of the event, he may not be able to borrow.
Right.
The market may be less liquid. The banks may be tighter on lending. Yeah. And you may not have access to that $100,000 when you need it. Right. So I believe that, generally speaking, the law of large numbers, generally speaking, that person's better off to have the cash in your hand.
Great advice there. I agree with that. Before we end for today's episode, is there any other advice you want to give to the listeners or anything you want to say to them?
Not all lenders are the same. So Summit Funding, we're licensed in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Florida. We are mortgage brokers.
Right.
And for the last 10 years, mortgage brokers have been caught in aspersions by some of the banks. But the key thing to understand is that we have tremendous capacity because we work for you, not for the bank.
Right.
Right? We work for you. So imagine if one bank is offering a better deal than another bank. You don't think the first banker is going to tell you, oh, you want to go to that other bank. If there's an issue, we have the ability to retreat, rethink, and come up with another approach that many banks don't. We have a very broad approach. So I'm hoping that many of your people, if they're looking to buy a home, will give me a call. But regardless, find someone who's a mortgage professional that you trust. That's really invaluable.
That's true. Finding someone you can trust to help you, that's an expert, that's on your side. They're advocating for you. That's probably one of the best advice you can give, really.
I like that. Let me just tell you one story because you'll get a kick out of this.
Sure.
Many years ago, one of my clients worked for a major money center bank, and he tried getting his kid a mortgage with that bank, and they rejected the mortgage. Oof. So for fun, I put the same mortgage into the same bank and got it approved. Sometimes it's knowing the levers, knowing how to operate.
Right.
And then sometimes there's a special purpose.
Right.
Sometimes someone has a challenge, credit challenge, an income challenge. People like myself, mortgage professionals, have an array of tools that they can deploy to get you the mortgage that best fits your needs.
Wow. Excellent. David, I think your information given today is invaluable and help our listeners tremendously when, I don't know if they're going to be applying now for mortgage. Maybe they need one in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, whatever it is, information they pass on to their kids. This is all wonderful. I really, really appreciate you sharing your knowledge today. So, we're going to have another discussion too coming up, part 2, or episode 2 of part 2 on the mortgage discussion. So thank you, David. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you for inviting me in.
Absolutely. Love having you. And Wealth Tactic Rebels, on the show notes page, we're going to put David's contact information and business information for you if you want to go view that. Also, while you're there, you can go to the wealthtacticrebels.com website and download your free guide to the 3 key areas that you could be losing money unknowingly and unnecessarily. Thank you again for joining us today for our discussion, and have a fantastic day.
Want to really see things differently? Take our course, Ingenious Tactics 201, where we teach you all the wealth accumulating tactics with detailed real-life examples. See your progress with quizzes and a certificate of completion. For course details, visit wealthtacticrebels.com. Sign up today and start seeing things differently.
This presentation is intended as informational only. The information presented does not consider your particular financial objectives, risk tolerance, time horizon, or other unique circumstances, and does not constitute a personalized recommendation or replace the advice of a financial, tax, or legal advisor or other qualified professionals. Do your own research and do not use the information of this presentation in place of a customized consultation with a licensed professional. To the best of our ability, we provide content that is accurate as of the date of release. However, we give no assurance or guarantee regarding its accuracy, timeliness, completeness, or applicability. We assume no liability for the information of this and related presentations.